Welcome to the Patel Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Harsh Patel. I obtained a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and minors in biology and biochemistry. Through that education, this podcast allows me to deliver proper health, science, and self-improvement information to the people around the world. If you have liked any of my podcast episodes, and if you would like to show support, the only way to do so is by subscribing to my YouTube channel and by following the social media platforms of the guests you have liked. You don't really want to miss out on the highly intellectually stimulating conversations we'll be having in our future episodes. Today's guest is Dr. Nitesh Patel. Dr. Patel is a fellowship-trained neurosurgeon specializing in neuro-oncology. He is also the assistant professor of neurosurgery at Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine. Additionally, he also serves as a co-director of Neurosurgical Oncology Program at Hackensack Meridian Jersey Shore Medical Center. We have talked in depth about his journey from high school to medical school and even beyond. We talk about his journey from being in high school, losing a parent, and to making it to med school and beyond. We go through in depth about what behavior changes he had to make in order to become the person he is today. Additionally, we also talk about brain tumors, the types of tumors, and also how to distinguish between tumors and neural tissue, and what's the role of AI in neurosurgery. I hope you find this podcast valuable, especially if you are a pre-health student, pre-med student, pre-PA student, etc. I, as a pre-PA student, will take a lot from this podcast, especially the words of wisdom that Dr. Patel has provided to me and the audience. And now, my conversation with Dr. Nitesh Patel. Welcome back to another episode of the Patel Perspective, and this episode is special because Dr. Nitesh Patel is not only the first doctor on the show, but a first Patel on the show. So welcome.
Nice, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. So right off the bat, I want to ask you a challenging question like I've promised all other guests. Tell me about a time where you had to decide that to become who you are in your future, you have to make tremendous changes in your life.
It's a great question.
Okay.
And I can think of multiple instances where I had to sort of make a pivotal decision in life, right? I think that's what you're getting at. And, you can think of, if you ever heard of the Jay-Z and Kanye song, Diamonds Are Forever, the mix with Jay-Z on, not the original. Jay-Z says, if you want to walk on water, you got to get off the boat. And, it's obviously no one's here walking on water and performing miracles in that perspective, but the whole point is led me to another quote that's often been said, in one way or another by people to me. It's, if you want something to change, something has to change, right? It sounds repetitive. When you really think about it, you realize that you can't expect the same results or expect different results doing the same thing over and over again. So in my life, I've had multiple events like that. I can think back early on to when I was in my teenage years in high school. I was 15 when I lost my own father. My father passed away when I was, a teenager, and my father was not a doctor. He owned a convenience store, like most other Indian parents do, that came in here in the 70s and 80s. And my mom didn't finish high school. So, our store, which was like a newspaper and candy store that sold bagels and coffee, was my life. And there's nothing wrong with that being life. But, I wasn't raised in a highly intellectual household where scholarly works were the day to day. However, I did grow up around a lot of newspapers. So, being at a newsstand, I got to read a lot. But, what I realized was that if I wanted to do something different in my life, I needed to do something different. And coming from Jersey City, where I grew up, public school system, it wasn't necessarily the strongest, but it wasn't bad. I found some value in the melting pot. Mm-hmm. And, I had to make changes, obviously get as high scores as you can in school. I didn't have room for error. And then, of course, that led me to college. I'm on 15, right when this sort of time period is sort of transitioning from those 3 years from high school to college. Got to college at Rutgers, and I quickly realized that all the kids around me from various counties in Jersey, and Jersey's got incredible schools. Don't get me wrong. So does Pennsylvania. So does New York. You're dealing with the creme de la creme of students. And in order for me to stand out, and at that point, I had already decided to go to medical school. I have to sort of stand out and do better. So I couldn't do the same things that I was used to growing up.
Yeah.
Things weren't just going to be handed to me or anything like that. I had to go out and get them myself. So that meant while everybody's out partying and enjoying college, which is nothing wrong with that. Okay. And they were able to do that because they had the skill set embedded in them from high school. They went to great schools, had a great, upbringing that focused on academics. They could sort of slide and be okay. I didn't have that option. So that meant I had to sacrifice, and I'd sit in that library and just study. And while other students were getting, A's on their exams, barely trying, I had to struggle to get those same A's and maintain that same competitiveness, right? That sort of translated to me into the rest of my life. You go forward through med school and residency. I had to make those same decisions every time where I was like, all right, I can do the norm and be average. And average for me is very different from average for somebody else. The average medical student is excelling. I was not the average. I came from a below average background, so I had to upgrade myself. And, those are some examples of where I had to make pivotal, difficult decisions and make sacrifices in my personal life for my academic and then ultimately professional life. And I'll give you an actual individual example. You can ask my brother, you can ask my wife, who's obviously both known me for a long time. They can recall multiple times where I'm literally at family events, and I'm not talking as a grade school student. I'm talking as a college student, even as med school, where I'm at a family event like a baby shower or like a wedding or something like that, and like there's a break. Guess whose textbooks are with them and studying in the car or in the hotel lobby or whatever it may be, just to make sure that I could keep up with the rest of the people in my class, because it's the only way to succeed.
That's very inspiring. So when you talked about your childhood and college years, could you point out certain habits that you needed to cut out in order to get yourself in med school?
Yeah. I mean, from a habit standpoint, fortunately, I think discipline was something that was natural to me. I didn't mention this to you already, but I know you mentioned you yourself have gone through significant, I'm sure, a mental and physical change in the last few years, right? Which is, again, anyone who's listening to this podcast or episode will see on your social media page. It's incredible, right? I've gone through that myself, right? I grew up a fairly chubby kid. I had to drop a lot of weight when I was in my teens. I literally went to a pediatrician at 13. He told me I had an A1C of 8.7. And I was like, am I diabetic at 13? This doesn't make any sense. So I quickly had to realize that I had to lose weight. And I lost over 80, 90 pounds in like 15 months. And at that age, I was 14, 15 years old. Right? I just melted off, right? You don't even have to think twice. You just stop eating McDonald's and it comes right off. But I had to cut out those habits, right?
Yeah.
So that's where it started. And so for my teenage years, early teens, I fortunately had discipline already embedded in me. I already knew that if I set my mind to something, I can accomplish it. And I just kept telling myself, the hardest person to convince in the world is yourself. If you can convince yourself to do something, you convince anyone to do something. So I told myself that from day one. And fortunately I had that, but other habits were always there, right? I mean, all of us loiter around on social media. We all loiter around on Reddit or the news or whatever we're doing, right? We're all doing it nonstop. So those habits had to be not necessarily cut out, but controlled. The key word is control. So I definitely had to do that. I mean, things like social media. I mean, you can go on my social media. I don't really post anything personal. My Facebook account hasn't had a post in about 10 years, probably, or something like that, that I've actually intentionally put up. So I don't really post. I don't really do those things. Those things are cut out. I don't really care. My social media account simply exists for me to put out the content when it's necessary or when I want to check in on people or just, spend some time loitering. But I try to maintain productivity at all times. So other things like other personal habits, like never have smoked, so don't have to worry about that, right? Not a big drinker. I mean, even in college, I would have to drink like every 6 months. Not that I didn't want to, I didn't really care for it, right? I didn't really care about partying or anything like that. So those things never really had to worry about. But for me, and you'll relate to this, I think the important disciplines and the important skills that I need to master were taking care of my own health, right? So that meant cutting out fast food that wasn't necessary for me. It doesn't mean I won't go and eat a burger. But, the last time I had McDonald's was probably 19 years ago. The last time I had Taco Bell as an Indian person was probably 18 years ago, probably at this
I
point.
can't talk to you. Taco
Yeah,
Bell,
I
seriously?
know. Yeah, so I just again, I don't eat those things at all. It's not that I won't eat, you know, Mexican food or burgers and things like that. I just won't go to. It's not really anything against Taco Bell. For me, mentally, I've locked that out of my mind. You know, I'd rather just make the damn thing at home. You
Yeah,
know, you could fry a tortilla and I'll make a Mexican pizza here at home, and I'm fine with that. But,
exactly.
so those things were critical for me, right? But then, of course, exercise, right, and making sure that I took care of my body for optimal physical and mental health.
Hmm.
Uh, so I've always maintained some degree of an exercise regimen, whether it was cardio or weights. I always transitioned, like from college and med school, I was a lot of lifting, got to residency and spent a lot of time running. I worked my way to run the New York Marathon in 2018. And then I went back to weights like a year and a half ago. So, you know, it's like, I sort of a bit of a sine wave as to what I choose between weights and cardio. But as long as I'm doing something in my mind, I'm good.
Yeah.
You know, so those are some of the disciplinary things that I've had to do and have had maintain with a conscious effort. It's not easy. Don't get me wrong. But to answer that question,
Yeah, definitely. So what about the habits that you had consistently added, or what are some things that are just natural to you? I know that like studying or just memorizing something, I think I can relate a lot about myself to you because I'm also from a single parent household. I never partied, never smoked, just always studied, and it was a struggle. Like it was a struggle to get to get an A. But what are some things that you like added, especially in med school and residency and your fellowship, that helped you become the person you are today?
so to answer that question, I actually had to seek help.
Okay.
Um, and I didn't know. I didn't know what I was lacking, right? I got to a point when I was in medical school and I didn't know what I was lacking. Despite all of my efforts, despite my maximum endurance that I was putting in the time, and you know, I was scoring well. That wasn't a problem, but everyone around me was able to score as well or better, and they weren't even putting in half the effort, right?
Mm.
I had to ask myself, what the hell's going on here? Is something not right? Like there must be a reason why. Like, am I just not efficient? So, you know, fortunately, I've been very lucky in my life. I don't have a million friends, but I have a few friends that are just amazing friends. That are very close to me. You know, I'll say two of my best friends are from my childhood. I've known them since so long as I can remember. And then in medical school, I made a very close friend who's an orthopedic surgeon now in New York. And we were, you know, we were like right and left hand, right? In med school, we would never be apart. We always spent all of our time together. And what I noticed from him, and I learned this from him, and shout out to Remy. You know, he's Remy Rabinovich is an orthopedic surgeon in New York. But you know, Remy's one of my good friends who emphasized to me the style of studying in more of a Socratic method, right, where it was more question and answer. It's something I never did before. I always assumed that you could simply look at a textbook and, you know, once you understand concepts, you're good. And for me, I quickly understood that memorization was not the answer. You simply cannot memorize something and hold on to it long enough for it to be meaningful. Sure, you'll do well on an exam, but you won't hold on to it long enough. So that's something that came naturally to me, was that memorization is not key. Understanding concepts is. What that meant for me was that allowed me to get through college easy, right? Allowed me to get through early years in med school easy. But when it came time to knowing details and applying them, I needed to switch to a more question and answer Socratic method. And that's where my friend Remy, for example, was very good at. We would literally sit there and just you know, quiz each other constantly on things. And it wasn't just memorization. You know, it would be, you know, you would think about your exams you take. They're all 1 step, 2 step, 3 step questions, right? They're designed that way because the 1 step questions are memorization. The 2 and 3 step questions are more either conceptual understanding or application.
Mm.
And that's where we really focused on our educational content. We would focus on the 2 and 3 step sort of criteria where we're forcing each other to apply and conceptualize the knowledge we had. And that's something new I had to add in. That carried with me into residency and into my practice now, even when I do my own teaching, right? Because now I serve as a professor at the medical school, and assistant professor of neurosurgery at the Hackensack Meridian School of Health. And you know, when I'm sort of teaching an anatomy lab, for example, or have students rotating on my service in the operating room, I don't sit there and just ask them rote memorization questions. That doesn't do anything. But I'd rather lead them to something and give them that moment where everything just clicks, right? It all just snaps into place, and they're like, "Wow, I actually learned something today." Even if it was one thing, they will go home and they will never forget it, and that's the key.
Yeah, I think the value of active recall is so underrated. After I took biology in college, I was putting so much time into the class, like 20 hours, and still getting like not average, above average score. But I was just thinking of ways to how can I reduce the amount of time I put and still get the best grade possible. And what I learned is like the more questions I answered and how I structured my notes, particularly, like really helped me in that active recall process. And I think it's also critical for students to like create notes that are in the question and answer format, and that's how I learned, after my first year of college. So I think study. What are your study methods, like top study methods that you can recall during medical school?
So I think from a medical school standpoint, I think it really tests your variety in your study methods, right? So in med school, you're going to be forced to master different types of knowledge, right? There's of course your standard textbook knowledge and there's anatomical knowledge, right? Then of course there's your patient interaction knowledge, how well you can deliver a message and stuff, and how well you can assess a patient in terms of physical assessment in real time. So for standard textbook things, it's the same things you learn in college, right? It's going to be one, of course, your first pass through reading it and understanding it, right? And then, of course, it's going to be either you are naturally good at sort of taking a 50-page chapter and condensing it down to 2 or 3 pages, or you go and get a study guide, right? That has it already done for you, a sort of Cliff Notes version that can help you grasp key points. And then with those key points, you then go ahead and write them out or type them out, whatever you want. Those are your notes. And then, of course, you try to reread those notes. Then that's the standard. That's the basic. And then, of course, that same knowledge, you can go to the whole Socratic method where you find a partner, a study partner, whoever, and you can quiz back and forth. And ask yourself, for this pathway in this step, what is the responsible enzyme or the catalyst that's important here, or whatever it may be. And then, of course, that covers your textbook knowledge, right, from exam standpoint. But there's anatomical knowledge. And for me personally, the way I understood anatomic knowledge the best was actually going into the anatomy lab. Now, for those of you who have been to a medical school before or are familiar, for those listening, that's a cadaver lab. It's a room full of donor bodies, yes, cadaveric, dead bodies, patients who were formerly patients who have now donated their body for science. And I want to emphasize to those listening that medical schools are actually, it's more of an old school model. You read about this in like old books and stuff. People used to, dig up bodies from like the cemetery and stuff and do that. But that's not the case anymore. People are actually donating their bodies for science. But I want to emphasize to those listening that it's as students and teachers, we're obviously extremely grateful, right, for that opportunity. These donors are in many ways our first teachers, right? It's literally, Joe Smith or whoever, a random person who may seem random to us, but now they have donated their body to science, and we're literally there dissecting this body over a period of weeks to months and learning. And these donors are our first teachers and also our first patients in some way. So we have to be respectful. We have to be mindful that it is a human being in front of us still, despite it being a cadaver. So I spent a lot of time in the cadaver lab. I spent a lot of time dissecting. I spent a lot of time with anatomy atlases and understanding relationships. And then, of course, thinking about them on my own body, right? So that's a way to apply your anatomic knowledge. And then it all ties together in clinical scenarios, whether in the operating room or with patients back to back. And that, of course, just requires practice. Fortunately for me, it's something that came naturally. I think those healthcare providers out there, including yourself in the future, if that's something you pursue, if you have a customer service background, okay, or a background with human interaction, it's going to serve you extremely well because that allows you to talk to patients and people and interact in a very meaningful way. And for me, as I told you earlier, my dad owned a convenience store growing up, and I worked at cash register, you know, uh, since I was a teenager. So I, met people from all over the place,
Yeah.
especially in an urban environment like Jersey City. So it was a skill set that I never thought about as being ever important in my life. That came back to being one of the most valuable skill sets I have. The ability to communicate with anyone.
Yeah, I think it's totally underrated because when I was a nursing assistant, and I think that job was pivotal for me in terms of my personality development, in specifically in talking to people and empathizing with them, stories and everything. But I want to take 2, 3 steps back, right between college and medical school. I know these are a lot of questions about pre-med school and pre-fellowship, but I
Yeah,
feel like there's so many college students out there, many of them, who have the dreams of becoming a doctor. They don't make it. So my question is like, was there a point in time in your journey that it was for a year or two, like everything was not working, or admitting into med school was easy for you? Like, was it easy transition, or was it a hard transition, or was it a delayed transition, or was it a fast transition? That's my
yeah.
question.
So I mean, you're getting at the whole concept of a direct admission to medical school, strictly straight from college, of course, without a gap year,
Yeah.
um, or if you have a gap years and multiple gap years,
Hmm.
or do you have to do anything else? And for me, I will say I was uniquely fortunate. I did a 7-year BAMD program.
Okay.
So the way this worked was in my sophomore year of college, Rutgers, New Brunswick has a special program with Robert Wood Johnson Med School where you can apply for early decision into medical school. And I was able to apply as a sophomore. And again, it's just like only those from Rutgers are allowed to apply, those at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And, it's a bit of crapshoot, like, I don't know, maybe 100, 200 people apply and they pick like 4 or 5 people. Um, so, I mean, I was fortunate enough to get accepted for it. And I don't know what specifically they looked for necessarily. Obviously everyone who applied had competitive scores and such, but I'd had extracurriculars and all that. But I just tried to be myself, and I would consider myself lucky for having gotten into that. And what that allowed me to do was, by the end of my sophomore year, I was already accepted into Robert Johnson Medical School, and I was able to take my first year of medical school over the course of junior and senior years of college. So when I graduated college, I walked into medical school as a second year student. Um, so for me, it was a little bit different. In many ways, it sounds easier. I didn't have to take an MCAT, for example; it wasn't required.
You didn't.
Uh, no, so it's a huge. I know it's a huge advantage. I don't think that exists anymore. I'm not sure, or that sort of no an MCAT bypass thing exists anymore. Regardless, it's not like I didn't start preparing for the MCAT. I was already studying for the MCAT. I
Yeah.
had got like something osmosis or something like that was the MCAT course back then.
Hmm.
Um, so we were like, it was like there's audio tapes back then, by the way. I had CDs and tapes that I was listening to understand. This is what 2000 and shit. This is like 2009, 2000, yeah, 2009, 2010. I mean, it's not that long ago. I guess maybe it is. Um, so it's a long time ago, and it's. I mean, you were 9 years old.
Yeah.
It's a long time ago in that perspective, and for me, I was still preparing for these things, and the moment I got in, I was like, okay, I don't need to worry about the MCAT, but there was a new challenge on the horizon. Now all of a sudden, I'm basically a junior, first week junior in college, in my junior year of college now, and I'm taking medical school courses with people not from Rutgers anymore, people from everywhere. And most of the students that go to Robert Johnson, are either locally in New Jersey or from Princeton or from Harvard and stuff, East Coast people, right? Just because it's an East Coast school. And I was just like, okay, this is a whole nother level, right? I mean, these students are coming in not just from incredible high schools, but incredible colleges, and just things just come naturally to them. And I'm like way behind trying to catch up and keep up. So it was a whole new challenge. And of course, you have the threat in your mind that if I don't perform and don't do well, I will get kicked out of this. You still have to maintain a GPA, and your GPA is going to be reflected based on your med school courses as well. So, it sounds like, oh, great, you don't have to take an MCAT, you got an easy ride in. Well, the next 2 years after getting in, you're sitting there proving yourself that, to everyone that you belong there. So, pros and cons, right?
Yeah.
Although I didn't have to take a gap year, although I didn't have to take an MCAT, and I was lucky and I saved some money on tuition and such, it came with a whole other side of struggle and stress and such. Um, but I do want to comment on those students who do have to take a gap year, who are facing this sort of transition struggle, and those who are in that junior summer applying to medical school, and like they just, they look at their self, look at their scores, and like, look, my extracurriculars are great, but my scores just aren't there. What do I do? And what I want to say to those students is, so first off, don't give up. Okay, um, look at all your options. Okay, give it a shot. You'll be surprised. Obviously, Rutgers is a big school. A lot of the people that I've known who are physicians today and practicing, or have just finished a residency or fellowship and doing fantastic, were in your shoes. They were at a point where they're like, shit, I didn't get in. Now what do I do? And then they apply again. Shit, I didn't get in again. What do I do? Okay. Or a third time. Okay. The whole point is perseverance, right? It's all about what you're willing to take. It's from Rocky Five, right? It's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward, right? So that's actually all that matters is, how heavy a punch you can take in the face and keep moving forward. And, or is that Rocky Six? I forget. Was there a Rocky Six? Regardless, I think that's important for our listeners to remember, is that you have to keep moving. And then, of course, don't rule out other options, right? You have to ask yourself, is med school what you really want? Or are you just doing it because your parents or everyone else wants you to? Because if you do that, I promise you will not be happy. I promise. It's too stressful. It's too disruptive on your life. It's not worth it if that's your reason for it. So think about other options. And then, of course, the question you yourself may ask me in a little bit is, what about the Caribbean schools and osteopathic schools?
Yeah, definitely.
So I'll tell you, there's nothing wrong with either option. In fact, in 2023, the educational content for both is identical, okay, to an allopathic US school. Mm-hmm. And admission into those schools is not easy. It's competitive too, and actually costs twice as much, okay, for some of these schools. So, if you're in a position where you're applying to allopathic US MD schools and you don't get in, and now you're thinking about either a Caribbean school, right, or an osteopathic school, here's the deal. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with it, right? As long as you understand that you want to become a doctor or a physician because that's what you want to do, and you're simply not doing it so that you can walk around telling everyone you're a doctor.
Exactly.
The issue is that if you want to have it for your ego, right? Yeah. First of all, you should not be a physician. Do something else that'll make you a little happier, okay? But if you don't want it for your ego and you genuinely want it for whatever particular reason you want it for, then it doesn't matter, okay? Go through with it. The schools will give you a fantastic education, and you'll be able to do whatever you want with that degree. Nothing will stop you as long as you're passionate and you work your butt off.
Whenever I was in the pre-med route, my family pushed me a lot into going to med school. Like all the Patel families, like most of the Patel families who want their kids to go to med school. Like my family was like, oh, you should go to med school. Like having a title of a doctor, you're gonna be perceived like at a higher status than other people, and then you'll have a lot of money, and you'll have this, you'll have that. But then I really asked myself, like, do I really want to go through more schooling? And I mean, at that point, like in early college, late high school, I was really underconfident in myself. But at that point, I decided I want to do a PA. And I think everyone has to ask themselves, like, if I'm doing a career because of my ego and the money, because I don't think that's going to serve us well in the future. I guess you can answer that one question. Like, Do you think your fulfillment is tied to your title and money, or the work that you do every day?
I think you're really touching upon a super important. I think this is the most important part of our discussion today. Is because I imagine this episode for those listening is going to be for those interested in a healthcare career in some way or not. Those listening will have some tie to it, and it's a fundamental question, right? And it goes back to all of us. I'll tell you that obviously, as a neurosurgeon, you know, I'm very fortunate to be successful,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm very fortunate from all aspects of it, from a social standpoint, from a professional standpoint, obviously from a financial standpoint, just because I have student loans to pay off, right? So it's good to be like, okay, I can pay these off and stuff and still like, not have to like just, starve. And I can actually, buy groceries and stuff. So, I consider myself very fortunate. But if you were to take all of that away from me, all of that,
Yeah.
okay, and put me back in my residency where I didn't have this, right? I didn't have the ability to do these things as a resident, because as a resident you're making like, between 30 and 50K a year probably, depending on, I guess, the year. Nowadays a little bit higher, but you're not making an astronomical amount of money, right? I mean, it's good, it's not bad, but it's certainly not enough for you to not have to sweat a little bit about buying brand name groceries, you know, or you don't have to sweat about like, okay, do I buy like I don't know, the Tuscan milk, or do I buy like the generic one from the ShopRite brand? You don't have to think twice about that necessarily. And as an attending, for example, but as a resident, you do. And during those times, I never really worried about the dollars necessarily, because I'm not a big spender in general, right? Um, so for me, the most fulfilling part of what I do, you can take everything else away, is like that feeling I get when it's like 2 a.m. and I'm driving home after operating for the whole damn day. And I just know that my last patient that I operated on, I saw post-operatively, is feeling better with whatever ailment that they had preoperatively. And then, of course, I go back and see my other patients from the day before I leave. I try to do that every night, even if they're half asleep. I wake them up just to make sure that they're okay. And then they know that although I'm going home, I'm still around, right? I'm still checking on them. I'm driving home. I'm in my car. And I've got Drake radio on. And I just feel like, okay, I did something pretty damn good today, right? Today was a good day. Today was a good day to help people out. And I accomplished something big. And that's all that matters. I don't really care about anything else,
Yeah.
or less. That's all that really, really matters to me, is that feeling I get at the end of the day where I'm dead tired, probably haven't eaten anything all day, maybe had a cup of water and maybe half coffee, and I'm going to go home and stuff my face with whatever's in the fridge, you know. But I just know that I made a difference for those 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever patients I operate on for that day. And it just feels good. That's a great part of what I do. It's the best part of what I do.
That feels like the most generic answer, but I think it's so deep. And I think everyone should be working towards the skills they could get, and hopefully can persevere after they become a physician or a healthcare professional. I think that's what should be the focus. And I also, being so young, I also sometimes deviate from the focus. Like everyone who goes into health, most people who go into healthcare really do want to feel like fulfilled from the job they do. But being young and having so many distractions around you makes you a little bit deviated from the purpose, the vision. And so I'm glad, like, even a person like you who has essentially made it and um passed med school, residency, fellowship, and you're giving out the most basic advice, but it's very essential advice. So I'm glad you're putting that out there. I mean, I guess we could transition on to health if you want, or dwell on some scientific topics at this point, but it's up to you.
I want to transition with one thing that
Yeah.
sort of ties in. I think you'll appreciate this. There's a book that I read, last year or the year before, I forget. It was the year before. It's called Dopamine Nation. Have you heard of it?
Yep, I do.
So, I think it's Lemke, or if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Um, Fantastic book, and I think it really ties into something we all face on a day to day, and something we've actually been dealing with for a lot longer than Instagram, Facebook, or MySpace, or Snapchat, or TikTok, or anything, right? Um, and it's this constant need for a dopamine rush, or that sense of approval. Okay, we need validation as human beings. Without validation, we don't feel important. Without feeling important, we have no self-worth. Without having no self-worth, we have no identity, right? And this book sort of captures a lot of that. This sort of what we've turned into. We've turned into, what I face as a child, or what people from my generation face as a child, or as children, I should say, um, with our parents, or uncles, or aunts, or grandparents trying to pressure us into becoming either engineers, lawyers, doctors, whatever, right? You know, although that sounds benign compared to what kids are going through today with social media, right? In many ways, it was the foundation for some of that, right? This has existed for all of history. This need for us to prove to others that we are worthy,
Yeah.
and I urge anyone and everyone to read this book. I think what we're facing today in society is a lot more than just your parents telling you to become an engineer, or a lawyer, or a doctor. You're facing social media indirect pressures. No one's directly telling you, but people are identifying the standard, whatever the hell that means, and you're expected to meet that standard. Otherwise, you are slacking, right? You are behind, right? You are not up to par. And I just want to emphasize to our listeners that that's not the case. You can't simply, look at everyone else and expect to do the same thing, because if you're doing the same thing, and you're like everyone else, right? If you want to do something different, this goes back to the first thing we talked about. If you want something to change, something has to change. If you want something to be different, you have to do something different.
Yeah, that's very powerful. That's very powerful, because in order to become, as we all talked about, my health journey and obviously your health journey, the things we had to do to become a healthier version of ourselves, we had to change a lot of things about ourselves. Maybe cut out people in our lives, or cut out foods, and add some things. And so I think this is a very powerful message. But I feel like before transitioning on, I want you to explain your entire medical journey briefly, because if a pre-health student is watching this, I want them to have a clear roadmap, because you are a neurosurgeon, but you have a specialization in oncology. So I want you to map out your journey after college.
Sure. So, as I said earlier, I grew up in Jersey City, went to public school there. Went to Dickens High School. Shout out to those people who know where that is in Jersey City. So after high school, I went to Rutgers, New Brunswick for college, where I got into that 7-year, BA/MD program, an accelerated program. After my sophomore year of college, I started taking my first year of medical school as a junior and senior in college. They sort of split the M1, or the first year med school classes, into your junior and senior year on top of your regular junior senior classes. So you're taking 20 plus credits each semester just to get everything done. So you get that done, you graduate college, and then you start medical school as a second year med student, because again, you completed your first year already in college. Then I completed my 3 years of medical school, and then I went to residency, and I did a neurosurgery residency, which is a specific residency. It's the longest residency of all of them. Residencies can vary anywhere between 2 years to 7 years, and neurosurgery is 7 years long. So I did a 7-year residency. I finished my residency in 2021, and my residency was at Rutgers again. I stayed at Rutgers for my residency. At that point, I went on to fellowship. Now, anyone who looks up my credentials will see that I had another training year at Lenox Hill Hospital with John Bookfar and David Langer, who are very dear to me. They're incredible guys, obviously friends of mine, who I spent my 5th year of residence, like I said, 7 years long. Year 5 in my residency program was a research year, meaning you can sort of do something a little bit different. That's still neurosurgical, but you can either spend time in a lab focusing on something you're really interested in, or you can go on and get an MPH or an MBA, whatever you want, so that when you finish your neurosurgical training and you're a neurosurgeon, you have this additional skill set. So I spent my fifth year doing skull-based surgery and open vascular surgery to see if that's what I really wanted to do.
Hmm.
And also, have a different perspective on things. And for me, going to Lenox Hill in New York City was great. I had a phenomenal year there. I was able to publish a lot of papers, etc. So I finished that fifth year, and I came back to Rutgers and finished my sixth and seventh years of residency, which again led me to 2021, where I finished my residency. At that point, I decided that what I wanted to do was I wanted to have a career where I was one of the lead folks at whatever institution I was at doing brain tumor surgery.
Okay.
What I learned at Lenox Hill was that although I enjoyed cerebrovascular surgery, which is operating on blood vessels in the brain, I really enjoyed brain tumor surgery. For me, it was the operations, the surgical portion of it was very technical. It really let me express my own surgical interests. And of course, it really helped me practice what I truly am passionate about is connecting with patients. And as any doctor or any physician or healthcare provider tell you, oncology patients, need a provider who's going to be able to connect with them, need somebody who can be there for them and always be there as a pillar of support no matter what happens. Because cancer sucks, whatever type of cancer you're talking about, whether it's body cancer or brain cancer or you name it, it sucks. It's a tough journey. And I wanted to be there for those patients to be as a pillar of support. So I decided to go to the University of Miami, which is, I think, the busiest brain tumor program in the country, if not the world. And I did a fellowship there with Rick Komatar and Mike Ivan for a year, and I sort of mastered, the concept of awake brain surgery, anterior skull base and pituitary brain surgery, and it really gave me a leg up. And then I came back to New Jersey, and now here I'm the co-director of neurosurgical oncology, as part of Hackensack Meridian Health Jersey Shore, I sort of work with my team, and we sort of run the brain tumor and spine tumor program here, and everything from surgery to chemotherapy to radiation. We can do everything in-house. We have a whole team of surgeons, oncologists, and radiation oncologists for our patients.
I guess two questions from here regarding your journey. The first is, at what point did you realize that, okay, I want to do like neuro-oncology?
Yeah, I think I made I went into residency, I had to backtrack. I knew I wanted to be a neurosurgeon before I went to medical school. I don't know why, but I just did. Most neurosurgeons know that either before they get to med school or they decide very late in medical school. There's very few in between. So I was one of the former batch, and I decided to do neuro-oncology probably in my second year of residency. This was 2015, in my second year of residency, and I had some pretty good mentors. I had, done a few surgeries at that point, where I was in the operating room every week several times, and I was exposed to a lot of brain tumor surgery. And I enjoyed the surgical nuances of those cases. I enjoyed the patient encounters, and I really was passionate about being there as a pillar of support for these patients. And I was like, all right, this is, I think, what I want to do. But then, of course, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do a mix of that with brain vessel, sort of a cerebrovascular or blood vessel surgery for the brain, or if I wanted to do strictly just tumors. And that's my Lenox Hill year to help me answer that a little bit.
Awesome. And how is the schedule different from residency? Okay, so let's just talk about residency. Like, what I've heard that you have to work 80, 100 hours a week. It sounds scary, but I feel like if you're really passionate about it, like, time goes by fast. I know you might struggle with like getting sleep in, like, keeping up with your health, but what is residency like, especially neurosurgery residency, and what do you operate on like every day if you had to operate on?
Yeah, so residency itself is it's a bit tiered, right? When you start off residency, obviously no one's just going to give you a knife your first day and let's let you fly. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say. They want to build you up to it, right? Mm-hmm. So the first thing I like to emphasize is the work hour thing. A lot of people either applying to medical school or in medical school, or even thinking about it, will hear about this whole 80 to 100 hours a week in residency. And it's like, how the hell am I supposed to do that? That sounds insane. And for X number of years, and then some people are like, well, I don't want to be a surgeon. I'm definitely going to be doing that. Quite frankly, no matter what you pick, you're going to be working long hours, right? In general, according to the ACGME, which is the governing body for residencies, the way work hours are regulated is that, it's not like it's 1950 anymore. We have, there's no cap anymore. There's a cap. It's about 80 hours. I think that's still the case. If not, it might be even lower now. And so in general, you can't work more than 80 hours a week on average, and you have to have at least 4 full days off per month, which does not sound great at all. Let's think about it. 4 days off a month and 80 hours a week minimum. That doesn't sound good at all. So the first thing I want to emphasize is no matter what residency you do, whether you do neurosurgery, family medicine, internal medicine, OBGYN, whatever, you're going to be working long hours. It's the same thing. These rules exist across all residencies. So I wouldn't let that deter you. The second thing is number of years. Yeah, neurosurgery is 7 years long, but let's just say if you wanted to be a general surgeon, right? Well, it's 5-year residency. And then if you're going to be a general surgeon, majority of general surgery residency graduates do a fellowship. Guess how long that fellowship is? 2 to 3 years at least. Guess what? You've already done 7 to 8 years. You want to be a cardiologist, for example, right? You got to do a 4-year or 3-year internal medicine residency plus a 2 to 3 year cardiology fellowship. You've already done 6 years, perhaps 7, right? You want to do, I don't know, you want to be an infectious disease doctor, you do internal medicine for 3 years plus a 3-year fellowship. So no matter how you cut it, if you want to be an expert in something, you're going to be putting in the years, and the hours stay the same. Now, as far as those actual hours, what do they mean in real time? So your first couple years of residency, when you're early on, you're going to be working those hours for real, right? You're going to be working 80 hours a week probably, right? You're going to be on call, whether that's for 12 hours or 24 hours, or you're at a hospital and you haven't showered, you haven't eaten, and you try to find water or coffee or eating a muffin from somewhere and to try to get through your shift. But those things are finite, right? It's not forever. And then when you start getting to your later years of residency, for example, neurosurgery, by the time you get to your second and third year, you've gotten used to it, right? And you've gotten into the habit of sort of planning things out. So you have time to get a haircut. You have time to go to the gym. You have time to prepare meals for yourself. You have time to get your groceries and sort of, be a human being. It's not perfect. I mean, your finance bro is going to have way better hours than you probably, but you're still working, but you're able to maintain your life. By the time you get to the middle and the end of your residency, you have residents junior to you who are handling some of that excess work of being on the phone and being in the hospital. And although you're still on call, you can go home and you can be on call from home, which means, you just plan accordingly. For example, when I was in residency and, I was on call and I was going to go to the gym, just took my backpack and my laptop with me and my phone, and I made sure that I had an exit strategy. Fortunately, my building had a gym in it, so I just go downstairs, have my stuff near me. I'm in the middle of doing RDLs or something like that, and boom, I get a call from my junior resident saying, "Hey, we have a consult for you to review." I get the story from my junior resident. I pause on my RDLs, take a little bit of a break, pull out my laptop, pull up, the EMR because it's all secure, and I can look at the images and review the history real quick and be like, okay, here's the plan. We don't need to do surgery right now. Do this for the patient. We'll do the surgery tomorrow, or we'll schedule 3 days from now or 2 days from now, right? However, there's been plenty of those times where like, okay, I'm going to drop the weight. I'm on my way in. Let's go to the OR, right? That also happens. I'll give you another extreme example. When I was running and trying to train for a marathon, anyone who's run a marathon or even a half knows you have to train for it, right?
Yeah.
So, being in New Jersey, I would have to run, 50, 60 miles a week, trying to get the miles in. So my general workout was Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I would try to get at least between 5 and 7 miles in, right? Usually would be on a treadmill just because treadmill is easy. If you're on call and you're running on a treadmill, you can just hop off and run in, right? Not a big deal. But, on the weekends, I tried to do a long run and, running 16 miles on a treadmill, which I've done before, and it sucks. It's not fun. So I would go run outside, and my general, workflow was I would make sure I would take Google Maps and map out a 20-mile loop, in like the 2 neighboring towns around me. I made sure my wife was home, and I made sure I had my cell phone with me. And my general, sort of strategy was, plan A was if I get called, right, my resident knew to send me an image and send me a quick little history on my phone. So I knew that if I had to stop running, I would stop. Next phone call would be my wife, pick me up. My bag of scrubs is sitting by the door and drop me off to the hospital. And if that didn't work, of course, I'd take a backpack with me while I ran. My scrubs would be in it, and I'd call an Uber to get me to the hospital if I needed to. Right. So I planned for it. That was the whole point, right? So that I could still accommodate these things. Because the whole point is, if I have time off and I need to plan for these things, I got to make sure that I can accomplish my own goals and my professional responsibilities without compromise. So that's sort of how you do it. And you can do that. You just have to get used to it.
Yeah. And also, when do you start operating in your residency? Like, how long does it take? And yeah, so what's the progression like?
So you'll be assisting in surgeries pretty much your first few months into residency. And by assisting, you'll be with a senior surgeon, obviously, or the attending surgeon, who the patient is there to have surgery with, and you'll be assisting, right? You'll be there to help position the patient. You'll be there to learn incision planning. You'll be there to learn how to prep the skin, and then, of course, you'll be learning the basics: how to make an incision, right? How to expose, and then how to identify anatomical things. And in general, we don't just let residents or junior folks sort of progress without them demonstrating the skill set. We start them off with basic things, and the most basic things, of course, are tying suture knots, right? And throwing suture and stuff like that for closure. Because for those things, the worst thing you can really do when you tie a suture is to just tie the knot wrong. You just cut the suture and you throw another one. It's not a big deal. It won't harm the patient. Or you tie it and it's a loose knot. You just retie it. It's not a big deal. But like once you start mastering the basics, you start moving onward. So that usually happens your first year of residency. By the time you get to your second year of residency, you know how to be a pretty good assistant. Third year of residency, you can be a great assistant and you can do some basic procedures on your own with supervision. By the time you get to your fourth, fifth, and sixth year of residency, you've pretty much sort of mastered all the basic surgical procedures, and you're refining things that you're really interested in. And then when you're a chief resident, your seventh year, you pretty much can do 90 to 95% of surgeries on your own. Okay. However, you still have an attending neurosurgeon with you, meaning the actual surgeon's there with you, and you're more than an assistant. In some ways, the surgeon assists you, right, while you operate. So the roles reverse. And of course, patients understand this, especially if a patient is going to a teaching hospital, it's understood that there will be residents involved. But I do want to sort of emphasize to listeners that it doesn't mean we just let anyone go rogue, right? We want to make sure that at the end of the day that the patient is getting the best possible quality of care, okay? And it's supervised, meaning we are there with them to make sure that, the surgery is happening appropriately and we are scrubbed actively involved. So within less than a second, we can take over if necessary. Or we do the whole thing if that's what the patient requests, and our assistant just assists us. So that gives you an idea of how involved you can get into surgeries over the progression of residency.
Awesome. What is a fellowship? I actually don't know what a fellowship is.
So a fellowship is designed, so I'll give you an example. If I did my residency in neurosurgery, I would come out being able to pretty much do 95+% of neurosurgical procedures, right? But there are certain things that even though you'll have exposure to in residency, right, you'll only do maybe 10 or 20 of them in 7 years because they're just fairly rare, right, for you to see. For example, an awake craniotomy, okay? That's a surgery, a brain tumor surgery, for example, done while the patient's awake, okay, and talking, okay? I have an example of that. CNN pushed down one of my patients a couple months ago with the patient singing in the operating room, so I had her sing. So, it's something that a lot of neurosurgery residents during your residency will see at some point, okay? But it's not something you're seeing every week or even every month at most places.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to master that skill set, if you really want to call yourself an expert in something like that, then of course, you need to spend some extra time with a place that does it more than just every few months. They do it every week or every other day. So for me, the University of Miami was that place, right? They do more awake brain tumor surgery, I think, than most places in the country, along with a lot of the other brain tumor surgery that I was interested in. This is, of course, just an example. And I was able to go there for a year and sort of master that. And that's the whole point of the fellowship. You do a fellowship after you finish your residency to call yourself an expert in something. If you want to call yourself an expert, for example, in brain tumor surgery or spine tumor surgery or peripheral nerve surgery or something like that, then doing a fellowship will help. And then if you're applying for a specific job where you want to carry that title or that label that, listen, this is what I do, this is what I'm an expert in, you can do that once you have that fellowship under your belt. You can do that with some validation.
Well, that's excellent. That's very inspiring, though. Maybe if I was really confident, I would definitely go to the med school route again. But I don't know. Having these conversations are like diverting my focus from the pre-PA route. So I'm going to keep my pre-PA lens on right now. So, but moving on to cancers, brain tumors, the incident where the patient has to be awake while craniotomy, why was in that case the patient had to be singing, and why is it something with the lobe activity that you guys were preserving?
Yeah, so I think the best way to describe it would be, in general, speech is a complex thing, right? We know that. I mean, just our ability to talk, we all take it for granted. Every human being, we all take it for granted, right? Even I take it for granted, even though I know how it works.
Yeah.
Or at least how a neurosurgeon understands it. We take it for granted because it's just natural to us, talking and conversing and understanding. But there's a lot of things that are played here. There's a traditional area, which is called the Broca's area, which controls the motor aspect of your speech. And for those people who are right-handed, a majority of those folks, 98, 99%, will be on the left side right here. So again, this is my left, right? It's right in the frontal lobe right here. To give you an example, that's like right here, okay? So that's sort of right there. To give you another example of other speech areas, that are important, would be Wernicke's area, which is more of sort of the area that controls your comprehension of speech, and that's back here. Okay, that's sort of in the temporal lobe on the left side. Okay, and then of course, there's the areas that connect that. Okay, that's called the arcuate fasciculus, as we classically call it. These things are changing. The anatomy that we understand it to be is not necessarily exactly the case because of what we call, connectomics, which is understanding the connections with the brain. But the whole point is that if you're going to be doing a surgery in an area that's related to the speech network, all right, you want to make sure that the patient, wakes up still able to talk, right? Now, the only way you can do that, if they're asleep, there's no way to do it, right? Unless you do a sleep speech mapping, which is not perfect. So when you keep them awake, you can test everything all at once, right? And the fear with awake brain surgery, of course, is that, oh, I'm going to feel pain, it's going to hurt, I won't, I'm going to freak out. And quite frankly, the brain has no pain fibers, so patients don't actually feel pain. And the way I do the surgery, and the way most of us do, is we actually do a scalp block. Everything above the eyebrow line coming back over the ears, everything above it is numb for the surgery. So because all that's numb for the surgery, right, they don't feel any pain when you're cutting the skin or anything like that. Okay. So, with that said, you can actually do the surgery and the patient is pretty comfortable throughout the surgery. So the reason why we do it awake in that sense is because we can test out the speech. And then, of course, you can choose. You can have a conversation with the patient. You can have a neuropsychologist ask specific questions. Or you can have the patient do something simple, like sing. My patient specifically, enjoyed singing. She wasn't a professional singer. She's actually a teacher for like preschoolers, I believe. But she enjoyed doing karaoke with her wife. And I was like, listen, in the morning of surgery, I'm like, why don't we just have you sing? It's the easiest thing to do. So I put my Spotify on my JBL Bluetooth speaker, popped it up in the OR, and I said, Christina, we're going to DJ for you. You tell us what you want to hear. We'll play it. You just got to sing along, and we'll sing with you. And we did some old school stuff. We did some Moana, which is what she ultimately went with because she knew. I was like, I need a song where you know all the words.
Yeah.
It's like I know the Moana soundtrack. I'm like, all right, that's it. So. That obviously was a hit. Obviously it went pretty viral, but that's how we tested it. And I was able to test her cadence, her rhythm, her pitch. I was able to, sort of see how she flew, the flow of her speech. And then, of course, we also, which wasn't in the video because it's not as interesting, was we also had conversation with her, right, in the operating room. Like, hey, what do you like to eat on, as your favorite cheat meal? What do you like to eat on a daily basis? Like, what's your favorite restaurant? And that conversation is important too, because that tests their ability to comprehend what I'm saying and then articulate what I'm saying. And then, of course, the communication between what they're saying and what they're perceiving they're saying, right? Which is basically activating the entire speech network. And that's the whole point of doing all that.
Well, where was the tumor located? Was it in the speech network?
Yeah, so her tumor was basically adjacent to what's called Broca's area, the speech network right here.
Oh, okay.
Very close to that. And that's where her tumor was located. So we had to be very careful when we, sort of resected.
How do you distinguish the line between tumor, like the boundary between tumor and the neural tissue?
It's a good question. I asked the same question when I was probably a second year resident, where to my mentors, like, how do you tell? I don't know. And over time, watching them do surgery, oftentimes surgeries, when we're in the operating room, there's a microscope involved, which projects the surgery on a small screen so that people involved can see. Or, I'm in the surgery with them, observing and watching them manipulate tissue. And over time, you can appreciate that the texture, the consistency, and of course, the color of the tissue is different. And the way you got to think about it is that if you had normal tissue in any organ, okay, that sort of tissue has a classic appearance. Okay, the brain, for example, has a whitish, yellowish appearance to it, as a consistency almost like Jello, right, and has texture almost like Jello. When a tumor cell in the middle of that starts to grow, it's one cell that grows, and then it doubles, and then triples, quadruples, right?
Mm.
That cell is growing a lot faster than anything else. In fact, the brain cells don't grow. I mean, the brain doesn't get any bigger or smaller once you're an adult. Well, it can shrink, but it doesn't necessarily, grow in terms of number of cells changing from that standpoint. But the tumor grows and grows and grows, and it basically creates a ball that expands. Eventually, the tumor will outgrow its blood supply. It's going to grow so fast that the center of the tumor, where it started, okay, is not going to get a good blood supply anymore. So that area is going to necrose or become sort of necrotic or dead. So that color of that tissue is going to be very different than healthy tissue. So in the middle of the tumor, it often will be like a dark purplish, blackish color. And as you move outwards, once you get closer and closer to the boundary between tumor and brain, okay, it won't be a clean boundary always. But once you get closer to that boundary, you'll start seeing the transition to normal tissue. And you have to identify that transition before you go. So it does look different. To recap, it has a different consistency, of course, and a lot of it comes with experience, but that's sort of a general gist of it.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Have you feared like chopping off some of the neural tissue out?
It can certainly happen. But that comes with experience, right? Cutting the wrong things and stuff like that. Complications happen to any surgeon. The more surgeries you do, the more complications you get in general.
Yeah.
In general, the risk of a neurological injury during something like this depends on the surgeon's hands, but it's probably around 5% or less. Which it's not zero, right? And it's brain surgery; it's risky.
Yeah.
So I'm often counseling patients that although we're going to be very careful and we're going to map things out, there's a X% chance of this happening or that happening, et cetera. And this is all part of informed consent. Now, in general, when we're actually going ahead and sort of dissecting through tissue and sort of getting an idea as to what is normal, what is not, we're obviously careful. Now, I'll tell you, depending on the area of the brain, classically, patients can go without certain areas and still be very functional. Okay. The right frontal lobe, for example, is a good example of that. Classically speaking, we didn't fully understand the function of the right frontal lobe, which is this area right here. And I had a patient who was actually on Channel 11 News in New York 4 or 5 months ago, which he had a right frontal brain tumor, and I took out almost a third of his right frontal lobe, or if not more. So he has a giant cavity in the right inside of his skull, where the brain used to be. He went back to work like a week and a half later as a construction guy, and he's obviously has a tough diagnosis. He's still going through treatment, but he's doing great. I just saw him like 3 months ago. He's doing fantastic. He's able to function. He's able to live his life, he's able to drive, do everything he normally does. I mean, from a cognitive standpoint, he may not be the exact person he was. He may not be able to do be able to do like advanced calculus or something like that. But for his life, he doesn't need that, right? I'm not saying it's not important, but I think classically speaking, certain parts of the brain can be removed or dissected or resected with I don't want to say minimal because that's not the right word, but with a lower tier impact on function, and patients can still have meaningful lives. The alternative, of course, is leaving that there and risking tumor staining, right?
Mm,
Which, of course, puts the patient at risk of recurrence or bigger problems in the future. With stuff that's developing the last couple of years with connectomics and understanding better network connections in the brain, we're redefining this as to what's important, what isn't, and are able to be a bit more careful. But this is sort of a classical understanding of it.
yeah, this is so cool. Um, yeah, I remember all of these brain structures. Um, it was really, this is why I picked neuroscience as my major, because I really loved learning about not only the structures of the brain, but like the cellular and molecular activities that occur in the brain. And so I think this is the coolest subject because I remember this guy, Phineas Gage. It's a classic example. Him, I don't remember the brain structure anymore that was taken out, but I think that's kind of a experimental or kind of an early experiment that the experts learned how different structures relate to different behaviors. So in that case, do you think like the is um, longevity and the lifespan is affected when you take out like a chunk of a brain that is maybe it's not harmful, right? Like you said, maybe the patient is able to live a meaningful life, but do you think the patient might live a shorter life?
No, I think I want to definitely emphasize that we're only taking parts of the brain that are invaded by something, right?
Mm,
Uh, we're never just taking a part of the brain that's functional because it's sort of we call it oncofunctional balance, right? Onco being sort of cancer and functional being what's functional patient. So we will draw. I purposely would literally draw lines in my head, in my mind, looking at an image. Like, I will not go further than this because I know what this means for the patient, right? At all costs, I will not go further than this. So maintaining that balance is important. Now, as far as what this means on survival, of course, maximizing the oncologic resection, right, is critical for survival, but also minimizing the functional damage, right, is also critical, not necessarily for survival from a time standpoint, right, but from a quality of life standpoint, right?
mhm.
So, for example, if you were to do a surgery for a brain tumor near a speech area, and you weren't careful, and just again, no one's doing this, but if you weren't careful and you didn't map things out properly, and the patient comes out unable to talk, not because of just a complication risk, but because you as a surgeon didn't plan properly, right, or something like that, where you were careless, whatever. And no one's doing that, but as an example, um, the although the patient will come out of that surgery with less tumor, and you'll be like, oh wow, I got all this tumor, I got a perfect MRI, it looks fantastic. The patient can't talk. What have you accomplished? Right? What have you accomplished? This patient can no longer communicate with their family and have no meaningful quality of life from that standpoint. You've accomplished nothing, in my
Yeah,
mind, right? For me, I think functional balance and preservation is important. The patient is my most important factor in determining my surgical success, how the patient looks. I don't really care as much about the MRI, or how this CAT scan, the radiograph looks. Of course, I want to have to maximize resection, accomplish my surgical goals. But if that means, taking a risk and taking a degree of function from a patient that otherwise I didn't have to, I don't personally feel that's right. It doesn't sit well with me. Um, I want to make sure my patients can go back to a meaningful life for them. Because if you have a diagnosis of cancer, and people will Google all kinds of things and start calculating survival and how many months do I have to live and stuff like that, or how many months before it comes back. That's called progression-free survival, and how many months you have left lives overall survival. These things are statistics, okay? They're on a bell curve, right?
yeah,
And patients in general are not bell curves. That's my general philosophy. I don't believe in sort of these strict concrete numbers. I don't use them in my practice. I just don't say those words because I don't think they matter. What really matters is how patients are doing preoperatively. Whatever time that is the patient has, whether that's weeks, months, days, years, decades, I want to make sure that that patient can truly maximize their time with their friends, their family, and the things that they enjoy.
Definitely. I think this is what I want to take as a healthcare professional in the future. Just being really kind of passionate about the quality of life on top of everything else. But do you think so? How does the tumors differ in terms of the cortical regions and subcortical regions? Like, is it more like, let's say you said like the lobes, right? Is it more harmful to have tumors that are subcortical compared to cortical?
It depends on the type of tumor.
Okay.
So subcortical tumors are obviously by definition deeper, right?
Mhm.
So they are more challenging because you have to traverse normal brain tissue to get to them. So in general, um, brain tumors are split into two categories in my mind. This is what I explain to patients. There's primary and secondary brain tumors. Primary brain tumors being tumors that originate in the brain and often come from the brain, okay? Or from cells that exist in the brain. That can be brain cells. It's a very generic term, probably meaningless term, but sort of glial cells, immune cells, right? Blood vessels, brain. The covering of the brain, for example, it's called the meninges. Those are all possible candidates for sources for tumors that originate in the brain or on the brain. And then the secondary brain tumors, tumors that spread to the brain from elsewhere. For example, some of our listeners will have heard of obviously breast cancer, lung cancer, things like that, which are in the news, and may have heard of the word metastasis to the brain, a brain metastasis. So these tumors can spread. A small cell dislodges and travels through the bloodstream, and our brain gets a whole lot of blood, right? So
Yeah.
dislodges, goes into a vein, makes it back to the heart. The heart recirculates the blood, and this thing just lodges into our brain somewhere and then decides to start growing. That's a secondary brain tumor. Now, oftentimes these secondary brain tumors tend to be close to the cortical surface. Not always, but tend to be near the gray-white junction, meaning the cortical subcortical junction. These primary brain tumors, sort of can be kind of anywhere, so to speak. That's a very generic way to say it, but they can be in other areas. So they can be subcortical and make them far more difficult and challenging to resect. Subcortical tumors are more challenging to resect. In fact, the vast majority of subcortical tumors will likely be subtotal resections, if not maybe perhaps a biopsy, depending on the location, of course. And the whole reason for that is oncofunctional balance. Sure, I can get the whole thing out, right? But what does that mean for the patient? It's not going to be good, right? So we have to be balanced in our approach. That's something to keep in mind.
Let's say a tumor is in the pituitary gland, and are those like taking out the tumor in that from that region? Is it always dangerous? Do you guys fear if there will be hormonal imbalances?
Yeah, so pituitary surgery is unique. There's two ways essentially to go from a pituitary tumor. You can go from the top, or you
Hmm.
can go from the
Oh,
bottom. We're often going from the bottom. Okay, meaning we're doing it without an incision that you can see. I would say 95 plus or 90% of the pituitary tumor surgery I do is done through the nose. I do it with an ENT surgeon. One nostril gets a camera, the other nostril gets my instruments. The ENT surgeon gets me to what's called the sphenoid sinus, which is a small cavity just before your pituitary gland at the base of your skull. Once we're there, I come in, the ENT surgeon helps me with visualization. I use the other nostril for instruments. I make a small opening at the base of the skull. I drill off a little bit of bone, and boom, I'm staring at the dura covering the pituitary gland. I cut the dura open, and at that point, I can see pituitary gland, I can see pituitary tumor, and I can often resect the pituitary tumor as a whole and see the gland itself and perhaps not have to touch the gland at all. And these tumors tend in general to be benign. Okay. From a hormonal standpoint, hormonal derangements or aberrations can be expected. They're often transient. And this is where I always bring in the endocrinologist after surgery and before surgery too. This is called a multidisciplinary approach, right? We have an ENT, we have a neurosurgeon, we have an endocrinologist, okay? We're all involved in making sure this patient gets through the surgery, gets through the recovery, and also hormonally is balanced. For example, if a patient comes out and their pituitary gland, was being crushed by this tumor, it may take time for the pituitary gland to wake back up or become fully active or optimal again. And they may not ever become fully optimal. In that case, they may need to have their hormones replaced with medications for the rest of their life. Okay. And that's where the endocrinologist comes in. This may be temporary, this may be long term. But these patients will come out of the surgery with no incisions on their head at all. Right? They'll come out of the surgery with a stuffy nose feeling. You won't see anything. Okay. And, they often do very well long term, very well.
Sounds like there's a lot of obviously teamwork in healthcare, but that's a given. But there's a lot of technology. Could you comment on like the future of healthcare in terms of, let's say, AI interactions of AI and neurosurgery?
Yeah. So I didn't mention it earlier. As part of my role as a neurosurgeon, I also teach at the medical school. I briefly touched upon it. Hackensack Meridian Health is a med school in Nutley, New Jersey, which is about an hour drive from here. I sort of mentor students from there and teach, and the students rotate at our hospital, as we're one of the major sites. And as part of that sort of role, I help lead a research effort within the School of Medicine and within our hospital. It sort of started off with a handful of students, which sort of met with me, and we got some research projects going. I have a pretty heavy research background from a clinical standpoint. I've been fortunate to be involved in a lot of papers and projects. And what we realized with what everyone's doing is the utility of ChatGPT, and obviously because it's for the most part open source and free. I think become paid now, but we took advantage of it, and we've assembled this ad hoc lab, so to speak, of like an AI and machine learning lab, whatever you want to call it. It's a group of 25 plus individuals composed of surgeons, PhDs, medical students, college students, high school students, anyone who gets involved with our effort. We meet once a week, every Tuesday. We sort of run a bunch of projects together. And out of that, I would say right at the moment, like 90% of our projects are AI related. We've taken ChatGPT and had it sort of pass the neurosurgical boards. We've had it pass the USMLE. We had to pass the SAT actually too. Or score high on the SAT, I should say, not pass. But we've been utilizing this for other things too. For example, I asked this question to our students early on when we first started, like about a year ago, with this research effort. And I said, if you want to be a neurosurgeon, for example, as a medical student, you're going to go and find a neurosurgeon and have them be your mentor. I had a mentor. I got plenty of mentors. But then I said, well, what if you just ask ChatGPT to be your mentor, right? So we asked this question: who needs a neurosurgery mentor anyway? So what we found was that ChatGPT works pretty damn good as a neurosurgery mentor.
No way.
Questions about anything, right? I mean, people are using it. So, that was sort of a test on how it sort of functions in an education standpoint. But what about from a patient standpoint? What about common patient questions? Can ChatGPT answer those? Of course it can, right? And then it helped us better differentiate the science of ChatGPT. Now, ChatGPT is not, the free version is truly just a language learning module. It's an LLM. That's what it's called. It's, the version we're using is not like an advanced, multi-system processing server-based thing that, we can necessarily have access to. Most of the ChatGPT access out there is an LLM system. So, we've been using it for patient perspectives, for medical education, playing around with to see if we can pass exams, like any provider would or any individual would. In the operating room, we're not necessarily using ChatGPT, but we are using AI. And the way we use AI in the operating room is through LiDAR scanners, right, to recognize patient anatomy, and then use it for AR, augmented reality, and virtual reality, where we actually put on goggles and we can see into the patient before we actually make an incision. We're using it to place hardware in patients, with far more accuracy and more confidence than ever before. We're using it for pathology. For example, I go, and you asked this question before, I go in and I take out a tumor. How do I know if it's a tumor versus normal brain? Sometimes I can't tell. So I have to take a small piece of it and send it to a pathologist, which takes 20 to 30 minutes. And I'm sitting there in the operating room waiting for the pathologist to get back to me before I close the surgery. And from a surgical standpoint, it's a small amount of time. My surgeries take between 2 and 6 hours sometimes. It's a long time we're operating, so it's not a big deal. But we're using Raman spectroscopy, where we can basically take a piece, feed it to a giant, digital computer software system, and the computer can basically take the tissue and then just virtually tell you exactly what it is by laying out all the pathological stains and everything on it, and give you an idea as to what you're dealing with in 2 minutes as opposed to 20 or 30 minutes. So that exists, right? We're using augmented reality in the clinic when we're talking to patients. You go back 50 years ago, you went to a doctor. If you had a brain tumor, the doctor told you had a brain tumor. You're going to need surgery for it. You as a patient have no idea what they're talking about, but you just accept it as is. Now, we're not just showing the patients the images anymore. We throw on, whatever augmented reality we have. You can throw on a HoloLens or whatever you want to call it. Surgical theater is an example. You throw on the lens with the patient puts on their goggles, you put on their goggles, and you can literally float through their brain with them in VR, AR, and show them exactly where the damn thing is, the damn tumor, and show you how you're going to take it out, and show the things that are nearby, things you're going to avoid. And the patients absolutely love it, right? Because it gives them something tangible, those virtual, something pseudo-tangible to go home with, and they go home with an understanding. And I think what it really does is it emphasizes the origin of doctors in general. Doctors in general, if you a real doctor is a PhD, right? Let's be honest here. Someone who teaches in an academic setting. Medical doctors are born from that. But it goes back to what medicine is truly about, and it's about educating not just students but also patients on their disease and providing them guidance. And it takes it to a whole new level, which is some of the ways we've been using it in medicine, about AI and machine learning and AR and VR and all kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. This sounds so cool. All these technologies that you mentioned, do you have to learn them in residency? Do you learn them in medical school, or is it like someone there in the or the surgical team to really help you guys out?
So, a lot of the new tech, stuff that already exists, when you're in residency training, you're going to use day to day. So you just learn it on the job. You have to learn it. But as new stuff comes out, companies obviously come up with this technology. And you, as a neurosurgeon, will be catered to by a lot of these companies. They're going to come to you trying to sell you their products to try to get you to use them, right? And then, of course, you have to be responsible. You can't just, somebody in a cool suit comes by and says, "Hey, you got this cool new thing," or something like that, right? You can't just fall for any old gimmick. But you want to make sure it's validated, it's legitimate, it's actually going to help your patients and provide you with benefit, or your patient benefit. But if you can do that, the companies that come up with this software and programs and equipment will send people that know how to use it from an engineering standpoint, the software standpoint, and show you how the functions are. And then, of course, it's your job as the provider to actually implement it. Now, these companies, you got to remember, are designing medical technology and software and algorithms and such. They're not just a bunch of engineers and scientists developing. They hire their own surgeons, right? There's a whole other side of this that people don't understand necessarily, is that even though you went to medical school and do a residency and become, you don't have to be a clinical doctor. You can go work for an insurance company. You can work for a development company, a medical device company, where they just have you on staff and you're there to help them do R&D, right? So oftentimes they'll send these professionals to help troubleshoot, how to show you how the stuff is used in the operating room. And of course, it will be a provider, doesn't necessarily do it for a living, but knows the basics to help you sort of understand it and decipher it.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I guess this is helpful for people who are really going to med school and that route, to have that understanding that, number one, that you will be able to learn all this on the job during residency, and second, you will have to interact with salespeople whenever you are a surgeon.
All right, you got to be a responsible person, not just go off for shiny things. You got to understand that, look, these things are for patients, and you got to do the right thing.
Definitely. Well, I guess I could ask you some last minute health questions that I had off my mind. When we talked about primary cancers in the brain, what are the causes of primary cancers?
So it depends, okay, on the type of primary, sort of brain tumor or malignant brain tumor, I should say. So we'll take gliomas, for example. We don't necessarily have an individual thing we can identify as a cause of glioblastoma, for example, right? Glioblastoma is a terrible disease. And since 2004, we have yet to come up with something better than what we already do for it. Okay. Um, it's terrible. It's tough, right? That diagnosis is not easy for any patient, and survival is very difficult long term, no matter what we do. But we still don't know what exactly causes it. We know certain diseases can increase your risk for it, but there are most patients who don't have those said diseases will still get it, right? Now, for the average person on the street or the average person that's not in medicine, they've probably never heard of glioblastoma, or they probably read about it somewhere and that's it, right? But in my world, I see it all the time. You know, this is what I see on a day-to-day basis. So the perception of the incidence is very different, right? So we don't know what causes glioblastomas. Gliomas also are a bit, sort of elusive. We don't have any pinpoint causes. Lymphoma is another type of primary brain tumor. It's a brain tumor that sort of happens from, it's called primary CNS lymphoma. The lymphoma can happen in other parts of the body too, but it's an immune cell tumor. That has some relation to immunocompromised patients. For example, HIV patients and stuff like that can have higher risk for that. Then, of course, there's meningiomas. Meningiomas are probably one of the most common types of benign brain tumors, right? But they can be related to genetic disorders, okay, chromosomal disorders, okay. For example, in the Merlin gene, you can also have, related to hormonal changes. For example, women who have sort of change in their estrogen levels can have an increased incidence of meningiomas because they are estrogen sensitive. Well, some of them are, and that's one of the things that can actually put you at higher risk for them. But in general, if you were to tell me that, is there anything that directly correlates to brain tumors? For example, it's common knowledge at this point that if you smoke, guess what? You're probably going to get lung cancer if you smoke a lot, right? Mm-hmm. I think everyone in my generation and your generation understands that. And smoking tobacco from a cigarette has definitely gone down. Maybe not other possibilities, but not other sources, but cigarettes have definitely gone down compared to where they were, let's say, 50 years ago. But there is no specific thing like that. You can't, although cigarettes and lung cancer are like this, they're tied in hand in hand. There's nothing specifically for brain tumors that we know that just, ties it hand to hand, aside from metastatic brain tumors, for example, breast or lung cancer or melanoma. You have a higher risk of getting a brain metastasis, but it's not guaranteed.
If you would be kind, we'll have to have you back on to discuss the health side of everything. We took a tremendous amount of time into like your journey and just learning about the basics of the medical process, the being a medical professional. And so I think when we go into health, it's worthy for us to like spend at least like 30-40 minutes on health and cancers. So
of course, I mean, I've obviously given a lot of talks on metastatic tumors and primary brain tumors and stuff. Would love to, give you perspective on that in the future. Not a problem.
So any last bit of advice that you would like to give people, students, medical professionals, healthcare workers, before we part ways?
Yeah, I think, I think persistence is probably one of the most important things at various levels of life. If you're going to do something, do it right. All right. Don't cut corners. And, the most important thing is don't let other people's views and sort of biases mislead you. Okay. And it sounds cheesy, but you're a unique person. And you sort of have to understand that living up to other people's standards and expectations of you are not a way to live. You should be setting your own expectations, your own standards. And, again, you have to convince yourself of that. It's something I've already said. The hardest person to convince in the world is yourself. If you convince yourself to do something, you convince anyone to do something. So I definitely want to emphasize that. And then most importantly, I think, don't forget, we didn't really talk much about support and people around you. Is, it's more important when you're at the top to have people with you than to stand there alone. A leader is not defined about where they stand, but who is standing with them. Okay. So you want to make sure that if you're successful and you all that is all nice and dandy and everything, that when you've reached your goal, and you want to celebrate, you have people to celebrate with. So don't forget your friends, don't forget your loved ones, and most importantly, your family and your spouse or your partner in life, whoever that is. Don't forget those people, because they're the ones that helped you in one way or another, get to where you are, and those are the people you want to celebrate with, and that actually will make you a better doctor if that's what you want to be, or just a better person. So that's sort of some of my parting advice. I think David Langer had put it best. David Langer is a neurosurgeon at Lenox Hill, and he made the distinction between a gold star and a North Star leader. Okay. A gold star leader is someone who's standing there with all the medals and all the nice shiny things and all that. But a North Star leader is someone who knows how to point people towards success and bring them with him or her. And that's what you want to be, because that'll define who you really are.
It's very inspiring. I hope that people take this with them on their journeys. I definitely will take this with me. I have a habit of rewatching or re-listening to my podcasts, and this is definitely going to be the one that I listen to later today. So I really appreciate your time on coming on to an episode of the Patel Perspective. And I can't thank you enough for sharing your journey and knowledge with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This is fun.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.